Everyone to Era 4 of APUSH History. In this video, we're going to be looking at topic 4.5 and the market revolution, which is to say the earliest industrial revolution in America. The theme this time is work, exchange, and technology, specifically the relationship between markets, private enterprise, labor, technology, and government policy. In this one, we're going to focus more on the technology aspect, and then in topic 4.6, we're going to look at the societal effects for this market revolution. So let's get to it. In the 1820s and 1830s, a market revolution was fundamentally transforming American business and global trade. This was largely due to mechanization and the expansion of various markets, both foreign and domestic. The development of factories and mass production increasingly displaced independent artisans. Cities grew and developed as factory jobs provided employment. Farms also grew and produced goods for distant, not local markets, shipping them via inexpensive transportation, like the Erie Canal. Thus, agriculture moved from subsistence farming towards commercial farming. This market revolution essentially created a new way of doing business, as entrepreneurs were trying to determine what consumers wanted to buy in advance of those purchases, so that businesses could have those products readily available for consumers when the consumer wanted it, rather than waiting for a product to be made. Mechanization of manufacturing often reduced costs, leading to more profits for the manufacturers, and sometimes lower prices for consumers. The first industries that saw this mechanization revolution was the textile industry. The British had been at the forefront of this with large-scale production of woolen fabric throughout the 18th century, which was part of the reason why so many peasants had been willing to come to the United States, because of the movement of landowners to enclose and convert farmland in order to raise sheep. The invention of the flying shuttle, spinning jenny, and water frame tremendously increased the amount of fabric that could be produced. And with the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin, increasingly that fabric would be made out of cotton. These inventions were closely guarded secrets in Britain, until Samuel Slater emigrated to the U.S. after the American Revolution, having memorized plans for how to build these machines in the factories that operated them. Slater would establish the first successful textile mill in the U.S. in New England, using the local rivers to turn a water wheel to provide power to the machines in the mill. The success of Slater and his partners inspired others to build additional mills in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and elsewhere. By 1807, 13 more water-powered mills had been established. By 1812, 78 new textile mills had been built in rural New England towns. More than half turned out woolen goods, while the rest were producing cotton cloth. By the time of the Civil War, 878 new textile factories had been built in New England, and altogether these factories employed more than 100,000 people and produced more than 940 million yards of cloth per year. Jefferson's 1807 embargo on British manufactured goods spurred more New England merchants to invest in building factories here, since they could no longer conduct Atlantic trade, which was seriously hurting their profits. The War of 1812 made things even worse, especially because of the blockade of significant port cities. These economic problems led some New England merchants, including Francis Lowell, to invest in the creation of new mill towns, establishing 2 water-powered textile mills in Waltham, Massachusetts. And these mills required lots of laborers. Most of the early workers in these mills were children and women, although many times entire families would be hired to work. And they often weren't paid in cash, but instead were given credit that they could use to pay rent on company-owned housing or to buy goods from company-owned stores. The housing was provided because more workers were usually needed than the nearby local communities could provide. Although illegal today, employment of children was commonplace in this era. In 1820, half of the nation's industrial workers, and not just in mills, were under 10 years of age. As the textile manufacturing in the U.S. continued to grow, a distinct system established itself in terms of how the mills were operated. The mills were actually a model of efficiency, with the great water wheels located in the basement powering machinery that processed raw cotton on the first floor, spun it into thread on the second, wove it into cloth on the third, and finished and printed it on the fourth floor of the building. These cotton mills were filled with machinery built for the specific type of cloth that was being woven, and the mill itself was essentially a giant machine. The Lowell System, as it came to be called, changed how it used labor, often using the children of New England farmers as a source of labor. They realized, these children that is, that their chances of inheriting a profitable farm or receiving a substantial dowry were remote because of increased competition from Western farmers. So they came to these new textile centers to earn more money than they could at home. And for some of them, it was to live a so-called cultured life in the big city. And more girls came to the mills because young women had more limited options. And the textile mills were seen as suitable employment for the daughters of New England farm families. Of these mill workers, especially mill girls, was very regimented. They did live in company boarding houses and were subject to strict codes of conduct and supervised by older women, often widowed matrons somehow connected to the mills. They worked on average about 80 hours per week, 6 days a week, waking up to a factory bell, often around 4:40 a.m., and reporting to work by 5. They had about a half-hour breakfast break around 7 and worked till lunch, which was around noon for 30 minutes or so. And then they continued to work until they returned to their company houses around 7 p.m. when the factory closed. Eventually, cheaper and less organized foreign labor replaced the use of young women working in these mills. One of the leading causes of this transition to foreign labor and the demise of the system was actually the coming of the Civil War. But the decline in the number of mill girls created a movement towards Irish immigrants, who were also valued by mill owners because they could be paid less and provided with lower quality housing. Soon, the production of other goods increasingly became mechanized and centralized in factories. The production of shoes, leather, paper, hats, clocks, and firearms had all become mechanized to one degree or another by the time of the Civil War. Flour milling had also become almost completely automated by the early decades of the 19th century. In some cases, the factories were so efficient that 2 employees could do the work that had previously been done by as many as 5. A key figure in this market revolution was Eli Whitney. Now, we've already looked at his invention of the cotton gin, which was a hand-cranked device that could remove the seeds from cotton fiber 50 times faster than a person could do it themselves, which of course significantly lowered the costs of cotton yarn and cotton cloth. European and New England was purchasing tremendous amounts of cotton. Their purchases increasing from around 720,000 bales of cotton in 1830 to well over 2.5 million bales by 1850, and doubling again in just a single decade to nearly 5 million bales of cotton in 1860. That's about 75% of the world's supply, and it accounted for about 60% of all U.S. exports of everything. All of this cotton production, of course, then renews the demand for slavery after the tobacco market declined in the late 18th century. In addition, of course, many slaves would be sold by their more northern owners, like those in Maryland and Virginia, because the climate was not right for growing cotton. And they would sell their slaves into areas that was producing cotton because of the tremendously high demand for labor and therefore the high prices that could be obtained for individuals who could work the fields. But Eli Whitney also worked on machine tools, which are devices that cut and shape metal to make standardized, interchangeable parts for other mechanical devices like clocks and guns. Whitney's machine tools to manufacture parts for muskets enabled guns to be manufactured and repaired by people other than skilled gunsmiths. This meant parts could be mass-produced, so manufacturing was much more efficient, reducing downtime as machinery parts broke or wore out, and you didn't need quite as much skilled labor to handle changing out those parts. It wasn't just industry that saw inventions revolutionizing production. Cyrus McCormick invented the mechanical reaper in 1834, which greatly increased the speed of harvesting wheat. The first reapers cut the standing grain and, with a revolving wheel, swept it onto a platform from which it was raked off into piles by a man walking alongside the device. Now, this invention could harvest more grain than 5 men were previously able to do, which then, of course, freed up more people to go work in factories. Another farming invention was the steel plow in 1837 by John Deere. Previous plows had been made out of either wood or iron, but this new steel one was much more durable, so the thick soils and the prairie sod of the Midwest could now be farmed. This would in turn encourage more Americans to move westward in search of land to cultivate and produce crops for market. And of course, remember, that puts them into increasing conflict with Native Americans. Of course, these new inventions could be expensive, so for farmers to keep their incomes up, they needed to produce crops that would make the best profits. Essentially, market agriculture or commercial farming, and turning grain crops into yet another type of cash crop. Basically, it just means farming is becoming another business. A transportation revolution was also linked to this growing market revolution. Until the 19th century, transportation had been slow and expensive, but political and business leaders in the U.S. had begun to construct roads and canals to connect the different parts of the nation. Now, we've already talked about the development of the national road and the expansion of it as part of Henry Clay's American system. But Congress had refused to fund additional internal improvements, so this form of road building and all the canal building would be completed with state and private financing. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, was built by New York State under the leadership of Governor DeWitt Clinton. The canal would provide an important route for settlers going west from New York. They could travel up the Hudson River to Albany and then westward on the Erie Canal to Buffalo on Lake Erie, and then from there to anywhere that the Great Lakes connected to. This all-water route from the Atlantic Ocean would also enable Western farmers to ship their produce eastward at a greatly reduced cost. New York City, at the mouth of the Hudson River, already really important to trade, would quickly become the leading commercial center on the Atlantic coast, as more canals were constructed, expanding the frontier areas that could reach the city. Other eastern seaboard cities, like Baltimore and Philadelphia, also began building canals to compete with New York. To get over the mountains, these canals were built with a series of locks that could be filled or drained of water to allow ships to rise or lower in elevation. And this basic concept of a lockstep canal is still in use even today. The Panama Canal, of course one of the most important in the world, using a series of locks to take ships over the Continental Divide in Central America. Although canals existed in both northern and southern states, most of them would be built in the northern states because that's where most of America's industry, and therefore money available for investment, was located. The invention of the steamboat by Robert Fulton in 1807 made river transportation quicker and cheaper. It also made return trips upriver practical, as ships typically had difficulties making any sort of progress in strong river currents. His ship, the Clermont, was able to make a 150-mile journey between New York and Albany in the absolutely unheard of time of just 32 hours, and that's going upriver. By the early 1820s, settlers going west could take steamboats from New Orleans up the Mississippi River and all the way into the Ohio River. And the popularity of travel by steamship continued to grow as both people and goods could move up and down the river systems. The early railroads were short lines built to supplement canal and river transportation. In 1830, the Baltimore and Ohio, the first railroad in the U.S., opened 14 miles of track going westward from Baltimore. To prove the benefits of using a steam engine on rails, a race was set up between a steam locomotive and a horse-drawn stagecoach. 2 tracks had been constructed side by side for the purpose of testing the steam locomotive, known as the Tom Thumb, and the race would take place on those. With the challenge accepted, the Tom Thumb was easily able to pull away from the horse until a minor mechanical failure caused the locomotive to lose power, which of course then meant the horse passed and won the race. Nonetheless, it was realized that the locomotive really ultimately offered superior performance, and investors encouraged the development of this new technology. Railroads then allowed people and goods to move at speeds that was unheard of at the time. Within just a short period, railroad mileage increased tremendously, and it would quickly become the leading mode of long-distance transportation. By 1840, there was 3,000 miles of railroad. By 1850, 18,000 miles of railroads. And by 1860, you were up to 30,000 miles of railroad in the United States, crisscrossing the eastern part of the country, because almost all railroads were located east of the Mississippi River, and the vast majority of them were in the north. Other transportation improvements during this time frame included the development of the clipper ship, which was the speediest sailing vessel of the time for both passengers and freight. This encouraged American trade and really even carried a massive wave of miners to California once gold is discovered there late in 1848. Okay, it's discovered at the beginning of 1848, but it's confirmed late in 1848. But what set these clipper ships apart was that they carried extra sails because they were optimized for speed, which means usually they only carried very highly priced cargo in relatively small quantities, things like tea, spices, and opium. One clipper ship actually set the speed record for a sailing ship in 1854 and held that record for 100 years. There was also improved wagon and stagecoach design that allowed the carrying of passengers and cargo over much longer distances. Stage lines were set up that took both passengers and mail overland from the Mississippi River westwards towards Oregon and California once those areas were added to the United States. And this was especially true after gold was discovered. Resupply stations were established every so many miles, which would allow the passengers to briefly stretch their legs and perhaps purchase a bite to eat, but most importantly for the stage to change horses, trading tired animals for fresh ones. This allowed stagecoach lines to travel at a very rapid pace. A similar setup was later used to take mail separate from the stage lines, the Pony Express service being established around 1860, whereby a single rider, usually someone young and usually an orphan, would carry a small bag of mail, changing horses roughly every 10 miles. After a long day, the rider himself would hand off the bag of mail to a replacement rider and then rest until it was his turn to ride again. By constantly changing men and horses, mail could be delivered from St. Louis all the way to California in as little as 10 days. Though the service was actually quite expensive, and once the transcontinental telegraph was completed in 1861, it ceased to exist. All of this revolution in industry and transportation led to regional interdependence, where certain regions specialized in one proper industry, and then other areas specialized in another, and they became interdependent by trading back and forth. The urban Northeast generally didn't grow its own food, and instead relied on the Midwest for food. Those commercial farming enterprises then shipped it back to the East Coast. Cotton was also being refined in the northern factories, but it couldn't be grown there, so it was grown in the South and imported to the textile mills in New England, who in turn transformed it into cloth that was then sold back to the rest of the country. But even though they were dependent on each other, the growth of railroads and canals meant that the West and North seemed more closely connected, and at least had an easier time moving goods and people. And this is a factor that will be important as the nation descends into civil war. The way the country was brought closer together was with the revolution in communication across distance. In 1838, Samuel Morse gave the first public demonstration of his method of conveying electric pulses over a wire, using what became known as Morse code. In 1843, Congress agreed to help fund the new technology by allocating about $30,000 to build a telegraph line to connect Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, following the lines of the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad. In 1844, Morse sent the first telegraph message on that new link. This improved communication system would help the development of businesses, the economy, and even help with politics by allowing for news to spread at a speed that was previously unknown. Eventually, in 1858, a telegraph cable was laid all the way across the Atlantic, allowing transatlantic telegraphs, so that what had once taken weeks to get across the Atlantic now could take just a few hours. One final invention that needs to be mentioned, because it fundamentally changes American society in the mid-19th century was the invention of the sewing machine. It was originally patented by Elias Howe in 1845 and then further developed by Isaac Singer. Howe actually sued Singer for patent infringement and actually won, earning royalties for every machine that Singer sold. But anyway, this machine had two thread sources, like modern machines, and a foot pedal to provide power. This would dramatically decrease the amount of time that it took to produce a garment. For example, a shirt would take an average of about 14 hours to sew by hand, but a machine meant that same shirt could be completed in about an hour. Singer also made the sewing machine more accessible for home use by offering time payments. And this machine would have a particularly significant effect on the lives and the roles of women in American society, which we're going to look at more in depth in our next video.